Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is Conservation in the Classroom, where you get the chance to interact with one of our experts here at WWF. My name is Kate. I'll be your host today. Before I introduce our awesome presenter, I do want to take a moment to give a shout out to all of the classrooms that we have joining us on screen today. So when I say your name, feel free to give a big hello, make some noise, let us know that you're there. So let's start with Miss Yoke's class from Mays, Indiana. What's up, guys? Can you hear us? Woo! There you are. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Next up, we have Miss Matthews' class from Pittman, New Jersey. Say hi, guys. I think they're working on their audio there.
Okay.
Let's keep moving. Next, we have Miss Engel's class from Chicago, Illinois. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. That's an awesome hello right there. We also have Mrs. Bohannon and Mr. Albertson's Gateway 6th Grade Center joining us from Kansas City, Missouri. What's up, guys? Awesome. And last but not least, we have the Helping Ninjas from Carmel, Indiana. Awesome. Thanks for being here, guys. For those of you that are watching live but are not on camera, feel free to give yourselves a shout out using the chat function that you see on your screen, and you can also use that chat to drop questions for Kristy. So Kristy, the reason we are all here today are WWF wildlife conservation biologists from the Northern Great Plains program. Kristy is here with us today to talk about one of North America's most endangered mammals, the black-footed ferret. She's going to talk about what threats are currently facing these ferrets and what her and her colleagues are doing to help address those threats. We're also going to learn from Kristy what we can do to help the ferrets and their habitat. So without further ado, Kristy, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll pass it to you.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see your smiling faces today. Thank you so much for joining us here on WWF's Wild Classroom. I'd like to give a special shout out to Luke LaCroix and his 5th and 6th grade classmates at the Moortown Elementary School in Vermont. It's Mrs. Hopper and Mrs. Tuffer's class. So hi, Luke and friends. And I wanted to have a very warm, special welcome to each and every one of you. We are very excited to have you guys here today. And I'm going to pull up my screen real quick. Great, hopefully everybody can see that. So today I am going to talk to you about black-footed ferrets, what they are. Let me fast forward here. Hopefully you can see the screen. I'm going to talk to you today about black-footed ferrets, what they are, where they live, why they're endangered, what I'm doing for World Wildlife Fund as a biologist to help save them, and what you too can do to help them. First, I'm going to share a little bit about my path to becoming a World Wildlife Fund biologist. Although I never dreamt that I would be studying these really cool fast foxes called the swift fox on the Great Plains grasslands. And I never thought I'd be able to restore populations of black-footed ferrets. Or I thought I'd be using drones to help monitor black-footed ferret habitat. Or testing cutting-edge technology to protect black-footed ferrets and their prairie dog prey from non-native disease. Or I thought I'd be working with really cool people in some of the most amazing places. And I never imagined I'd be working for the World Wildlife Fund for a long time now. But I got here by working hard and pursuing my dreams. Today, I am lucky enough to be studying one of my favorite wildlife species on Earth, the black-footed ferret. Give a thumbs up if you guys have heard about black-footed ferrets before. Yes, good. Some of you, that's exciting. Yay. So what is a black-footed ferret? Black-footed ferrets are long, slender animals, enabling them to easily move through prairie dog burrows. They weigh between 1.5 and 2.5 pounds and can grow up to 24 inches long. A strip of dark fur across their eyes gives them the appearance of wearing a mask, which is why we call them the masked bandits of the prairie. The black-footed ferret was once found throughout the Great Plains, mountain basins, and grasslands of North America, wherever prairie dogs occurred. The black-footed ferret is one of North America's most endangered mammals. Give a thumbs up if you've heard what endangered means. Good, so some of you know, that's exciting. Mostly endangered means there are very few animals remaining on Earth. So black-footed ferrets are very endangered. In fact, there are fewer than 300 ferrets in the wild today. But to remove them from the endangered species list or to get their numbers up, we need 3,000 of them. They rely on prairie dogs for food and prairie dog burrows for shelter and raising their young. And this specialization on prairie dogs was a really, really great strategy until prairie dog populations started to decline. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, long before many of us were born, prairie dog populations were reduced by 98%. So ferret populations also declined. And there are three main reasons this happened. First, habitat loss. Most of you probably know that habitat is where animals live. And basically, European settlers started moving onto the grasslands, and the soil was rich and fertile, so they started plowing up the prairie, as you see here, to plant crops to grow food and to graze their cattle. The second reason prairie dog populations and ferret populations declined was prairie dog populations were in trouble. So with the plowing of the prairie dogs were plowed under, and there was also a large effort to get rid of prairie dogs because prairie dogs eat grass and so do cows. So there was competition for some of those resources. The third reason ferrets and prairie dogs declined was this disease called sylvatic plague. It's non-native. It's transmitted by fleas infected with a plague bacteria, and both prairie dogs and ferrets have little natural immunity to it, so they quickly die from it. By the late 60s, there were so few ferrets left in the United States, Canada, and Mexico that they were listed as endangered. Then a small population was found in South Dakota, where there was probably about 90 ferrets left. Then because they were endangered, biologists decided they would try to trap some of them up and try to breed them in captivity in order to save the species from extinction. Sadly, those breeding attempts were not successful, and no ferret kits or ferret babies were produced. At that same time, the population in the wild, those 90 animals died from sylvatic plague. And sadly, the last captive breeding animal died in 1979. So we really thought that ferrets were extinct again. But thanks to a ranch dog named Shep, as you see here, black-footed ferrets were saved from extinction. So Shep brought a ferret to his owners, and that led to the discovery of yet another population in Wyoming. And that was very exciting because this saved the species from forever disappearing from our planet. So biologists trapped the last of those ferrets up, brought those animals in captivity, and thankfully that effort was very successful. And because of that, ferrets are alive today. Unfortunately, the ferret population in Wyoming, where they last found them, perished. So it was a good thing they trapped them up. And those efforts were so successful that we were able to produce enough ferret kits in captivity to be able to release them back into the wild. So in 1991, black-footed ferrets were first reintroduced back into the wild after we thought they would be gone forever. And since then, ferrets have been released into prairie dog colonies in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Although many reintroductions have helped to reestablish ferrets, fewer than 300 live in the wild today, as I mentioned earlier. And also, remember that I mentioned that we need 3,000 to remove them from the Endangered Species List to ensure that it's going to persist forever and ever? Well, those ferrets need to live in 30 places. Currently, we only have ferrets living in 15 places. So we have a long, long way to go. Why are there only 300 ferrets in the wild? Well, there's two main reasons. First, I mentioned sylvatic plague. It's that non-native disease that is transmitted by fleas, and it very quickly kills both ferrets and their prairie dog prey. And then secondly, we really don't have a lot of places left in the wild where ferrets can live because there are not enough prairie dogs for them to live in. So how do we get to 3,000 ferrets in 30 places? Well, we have to very consistently and persistently address the threats that limit their ability to survive in every place they exist. So each year we prevent or try to stop sylvatic plague from killing ferrets and prairie dogs by reducing flea populations in prairie dog colonies by applying a dust that helps eliminate fleas. This is a prairie dog burrow, and this is where the dust goes down into it. Sometimes we deliver these fun peanut butter flavored vaccines to prairie dogs in bait form. And we do that by delivering them from a drone or driving an ATV. And as you'll see here at the top left of the ATV, there's a dispenser that shoots the baits out onto the prairie, and the prairie dogs eat them and then are protected from plague. As you see here, here's a prairie dog, here's a bait. He's thinking about eating one of those, and if he does, we will be able to protect him from plague. We also vaccinate each ferret released into the wild and each ferret born into the wild against plague. So we live trap them and give them this very special vaccine. We also give them a microchip, much like your dogs have, so that we can identify them later. We also annually monitor the size and number of prairie dogs where they live. This picture here shows a really cool prairie dog colony. You can see the burrows and little prairie dogs standing up on them. So we know by measuring colony size and how many prairie dogs are in an area, how suitable this particular site is for ferrets. We also each year try to count how many ferrets live at each site. We do that by using spotlights to walk or drive through a prairie dog colony to find ferrets by detecting their notorious green eye shine and track them to the burrow they are in to then try to identify each individual. We also work with many people, public, tribal, state, private, landowners, and land management agencies to find new places to put ferrets and to establish new populations. We fundraise to support each ferret population and all the activities I talked to you about earlier. And we also conduct research on sylvatic plague to help keep plague at bay from this cute little prairie dog, its favorite food snack, and tools to manage plague. So these tools are essential ingredients in ferret recovery. What else is exciting are innovative technologies like what you're seeing here. This is a thermal camera showing a black-footed ferret coming out of a prairie dog burrow at night. It's turning its head, it's scoping around, it's looking for danger, it's checking out what's going on, because ferrets live in prairie dog burrows and they only come out at night. So we have to be pretty stealthy in trying to find them. So this technology is not only really, really fun to use, but very importantly, it really helps us better count and find ferrets in these very, very large places where they live. And why does this matter? Well, it matters because we need to know how close we are to reaching the goal of 3,000 ferrets in the wild. So now that you know a little bit more about the masked bandits of the prairie, pretty soon he's going to come all the way out of the burrow. Here's what you can do to help them. First, please consider becoming a black-footed ferret ambassador. Learn more about black-footed ferrets and their prairie dog habitat and share what you learn with your family and friends. Second, do your part to protect our climate and our Earth. What happens to our planet happens to us and happens to animals. Since I was born, half the animals on Earth have disappeared to human activities. So we have a responsibility to try really hard to save the habitat and the animals that are left. So whether you recycle, whether you turn off your lights, whether you use less plastic, grow your own food, become a biologist yourself, help others learn how to become biologists, whatever it may be, it does make a difference because it's really important that I know that ferrets will exist, that you know ferrets will exist, that your grandkids will know ferrets exist for all eternity. And finally, I encourage you to live your dreams. Life is really great. We have a lot of really great opportunities to leave a legacy of conservation of wildlife forever. And it's also fun. So I encourage you to create or find a job that you love to do and you believe in. Going to work should be really fun. I feel really lucky that my job is exciting and that I get to study this very, very special animal every day. So have a positive attitude, work hard, make sure you get good grades in school right now, and demonstrate through your actions that you are dependable and trustworthy. And I promise you, you will get hired wherever you want to get hired because your reputation will speak for itself. So with that, I just want to say a big, big thanks for listening today. And with that, I'll totally take questions. And go Team Ferret.
That was awesome, Kristy. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we all have learned a great deal about black-footed ferrets and what we can do to help. So thank you so much for talking to us. We are going to open it up for questions now. So classrooms, get your questions ready, including any of you that are watching off camera. Be sure to drop those questions in the chat. We're going to go one at a time here, letting our classes get on screen and ask Kristy a question. So let's start with Miss Yoke's class. You guys are up first. If you have that question ready, go ahead and ask it.
How long have you guys been studying black ferrets?
You mean just?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I'm up here. So how long have you been studying black ferrets?
I have been studying black-footed ferrets for 19 years. It makes me a little bit old, for longer than you've been alive.
All right.
That's a great question. Okay, next up, Ms. Matthews' class. We didn't hear from you earlier. You guys there? Can you hear us?
Wait, hold on, unmute myself. All right, okay.
We can hear you.
Mateo, go ahead.
Hi. So I was wondering, do you think the black-footed ferrets are going to be extinct, or do you think you're going to be able to save them?
Great question. I am doing everything in my power to save them, and I have great hope that we can. And with help from you guys, I think we have a great shot at making sure that ferrets live on this planet forever.
Okay, next up, Miss Engel's class. If you guys are ready, your turn to ask a question.
How does the black-footed ferret catch or kill the prairie dogs?
That's a fun question. So, are you ready for this? Okay, well, prairie dogs are awake during the day, and they live in underground burrows, right? So they also live in family groups. So at night, when it gets dark, they go down into their burrows and they go to their dens and they cuddle up all together in a pile. Black-footed ferret comes out at night when prairie dogs are sleeping. So it'll come out of the burrow, it'll go across the prairie, it'll find a hole, another burrow where prairie dogs are. It'll go down into the burrow, and then it'll sneak down, down, down until it finds a prairie dog in the pile, and then it quietly but quickly grabs the prairie dog around the neck and squeezes it and brings it back out of the burrow, just like that. And while sad it is for that particular prairie dog, the ferret kits that are getting that meal, they dance around and they're so happy because mom is bringing them food. So we know that sometimes individual prairie dog losses are hard, but that prairie dog fed 3 ferret kits and its mama. So they can survive in the wild too. Great question.
Black-footed ferrets are so stealthy. Who knew? Next
They
up,
are.
Mrs. Bohannon and Mr. Albertson's group.
What kind of predators live in the grassland?
Nice and loud for us.
Yeah. I heard it.
What kind of predators live in the grassland?
That's an excellent question. So we like to call prairie dogs the chicken McNuggets of the prairie because everybody eats them. So predators that you will find on the prairie, in addition to black-footed ferrets, are coyotes, red-tailed hawks, golden eagles, ferruginous hawks, badgers, rattlesnakes, great horned owls, and that list goes on and on. Sometimes bobcats. But there are 150 wildlife species that rely on prairie dogs and their burrows for survival. And those predators that I just listed are some of them. That was a really great question.
Okay, great. Next up is Miss Barry and the Helping Ninjas. What's your question for Kristy?
Hi, I'm Leo. Founder / creator of the Helping Ninjas. And my question is to our ecosystem.
Can you please repeat the question?
Say it again.
What will happen to the ferrets what will happen to our ecosystem if ferrets go extinct?
That's a really good question too. Hi, everybody. So remember when I said there are 150 species that depend on prairie dogs for survival, including black-footed ferrets? So if plague comes into an area and kills prairie dogs and ferrets, then all of the animals that live in that prairie dog colony also perish or have no place to live. So it's a domino effect. Have you guys ever played dominoes? Give a thumbs up or wave if you have. Or, if you line up a bunch of Legos and you knock them all down, everything falls apart, right? So if we take ferrets and prairie dogs out of the system, then things like burrowing owls, cottontail rabbits, coyotes, badgers, swift foxes, ferruginous hawks, all of those animals disappear too. And then what else happens is then even arthropods like bugs and butterflies and little snakes and tiger salamanders, they also die because prairie dog burrows start to fill in, they start to collapse, the grass starts to grow tall. So by removing prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets, many, many, many other species perish and will not survive. So that's why, I don't know if you guys know the word keystone. prairie dogs are considered a keystone species. So I encourage you to look that word up. It just means that they are really important to the ecosystem that they live in, because many wildlife species depend on them as food or their habitat for survival and protection from the elements. Great question.
These are some really great questions so far. You guys are doing great. I'm going to take a question from the chat now, Kristy. So we had Aiden from Naperville, Illinois ask, how long do you think it will take to get to 3,000 ferrets in the wild?
Wow, really good question. So very excitingly, only 12 years ago, we had 1,000 ferrets in the wild. So we were a third of the way towards meeting our recovery goals. But then plague came through a really, really big area in South Dakota where we had a lot of ferrets, and we weren't able to save all of the ferrets. So to get to 3,000 now from 300, I'm guessing we are going to need 30 to 50 years, which means we're going to need your help. We need you guys to grow up and become biologists and help out.
Okay, great. So now we're going to start from the top and go through our next round of questions. So we're back to Mrs. Yoke. If you guys are ready for your next question for Kristy, you guys are up.
Is there any other animals that black-footed ferrets eat?
Really good question. So the majority of their diet includes prairie dogs. So, and they pretty much do not live outside of prairie dog burrows and outside of prairie dog towns, but they will opportunistically eat mice or rabbits. That was a really good question.
That was a really good question. Okay, next up, Miss Matthews' class.
Why do the black-footed ferrets only eat prairie dogs?
Really good question. That's a hard one to answer, but it comes from evolutionary time. So this is kind of a complicated answer, but just like you and I were born here in the United States, and we have acclimated to seasonal changes, right? We know how to live in summer and fall and winter and spring. Black-footed ferrets learn to evolve with prairie dogs. That's why they are long and tubular shaped, because prairie dog burrows are narrow. So this particular species of black-footed ferrets really learned how to just be specialists of ferrets. And they were specialists because there were so many, many, many prairie dogs long time ago. There used to be prairie dogs from Canada to Mexico. And so it was a good strategy to learn how to eat one food source, because they could live in a very small area, live in those burrows, and they got really good at hunting prairie dogs, and it became really effective for them. So because that was good strategy, the traits that keep them learning how to hunt and navigate in burrows was efficient. Now that there are fewer prairie dogs, it's not such a good strategy. It would be really, really helpful if they could eat other things outside of just prairie dogs. Good question.
That was a great question. Moving on to Miss Engel's class. What's your next question for Kristy?
How does the black-footed ferret adapt to the changing environment?
Really, really good question. So, as you know, we have kind of some crazy weather these days, right? We have either really, really hot and dry weather, or we have really, really cold and wet weather, or we have like big floods, we have big fires, or sometimes it's just really nice out, right? So those extreme of temperatures like this are very difficult. And when that happens, plague, the non-native disease I talked about, becomes a lot more of a risk to ferrets. So I have to say that I'm not sure ferrets have evolved much resistance to plague. Their prairie dog prey hasn't evolved resistance to plague, not yet. Maybe in 100 years they could, but they do best when they have a lot of prairie dogs to eat and a lot of safety in the form of burrows. So it's really our job to help them to adapt to that changing climate by protecting them and their prairie dog prey from plague, but also to make sure that we are creating space for them in the wild in places where there are enough prairie dogs for them to survive. So for example, this place where I work in Montana, we had a really, really dry summer, and there wasn't very much grass for prairie dogs to eat. And so prairie dog pups that are born in the spring were teeny tiny, and they weren't fat, and they didn't look very healthy. And so when winter came, some of those prairie dog pups didn't do very well. However, that was a really easy food source for ferrets. So while prairie dogs didn't do well because of the drought, ferrets were able to eat a lot of prairie dogs that weren't going to survive the winter. So sometimes that can be a benefit, but then it also can turn out to be detrimental if there isn't more prairie dogs the following year. So it's very cyclical, and it's really our job to help ferrets in the best way we can. And to combat some of those changing climate conditions, we need to have enough ferrets in enough places.
Great question.
Really
and great
good question.
Next up is Mrs. Bohannon and Mr. Albertson's group. What's your next question?
Can you say that again, please? Can you yell it really loud? No, I can't hear you at all. Maybe try again. Come closer to the mic.
Do black-footed ferrets have predators?
Great question. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yes, they do have predators. So black-footed ferrets have to avoid coyotes. Coyotes will kill black-footed ferrets. Sometimes swift foxes, which are about a fraction of the size of coyotes, but a little bit bigger than ferrets, they will also kill ferrets. And finally, we think sometimes badgers kill ferrets, and we think where there are trees along a prairie dog colony, great horned owls will kill ferrets. Very good question.
Okay, next up is the ninjas. What's up? What's your question?
What can our class do to help ferrets?
Say that one more time.
What can our class do to help ferrets?
Oh, that's a really fun question. You can learn as much as you possibly can about black-footed ferrets. You could also learn as much as you can about prairie dogs, and you can maybe give a presentation to other classmates about prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets in the Great Plains. The other thing you could probably do is adopt a black-footed ferret through World Wildlife Fund and help contribute to their cause by helping us save them in the wild. Thank you for asking that.
That was a great question. Next, let's take one from the chat. So we have Keith from Rhode Island that wants to know, what effect does the use of pesticides or herbicides have on black-footed ferrets?
Really hard and difficult question, but a very important one. So we use a dust to reduce flea populations. We also use an ingredient called fipronil. It's the same thing as Frontline that you may put on your dogs and cats to keep fleas and ticks at bay. So those two things keep fleas from transmitting plague to both prairie dogs and ferrets. So while they are not necessarily the best tool because they are insecticides and may have some toxicity, they are safe for ferrets and prairie dogs. They are also safe for grassland birds, and they have had extensive studies to show that the impact to the ecosystem is very minimal. That said, we are working very, very hard to find tools that do not have impacts to other species outside of ferrets and prairie dogs as well, like the sylvatic plague vaccine baits. Those are safe to ferrets, prairie dogs, and anything else that eats them. So we're working really hard at that. But the thing that to keep in mind is that the dust that we use and the fipronil that we use are used at scale in the agricultural and household communities around the United States. And we are using a very small fraction of that in 20,000 acres of prairie dog colonies where ferrets live in the United States, which is a drop in the bucket to the 5 million acres that are being used across the West. Very good question.
Okay, awesome. I think we have just enough time to maybe do one more round of questions. So we'll start back up with Miss Yoke. This might be your last question to ask, so make it a good one.
About the black-footed ferrets, and we are wondering why the birth kits have went up and down.
Why what went up and down?
Birth of kits.
I'm sorry, I'm still having a hard time understanding, hearing you. Can you say that one more time?
So we were wondering why the birth of the kits have been going up and down.
Oh, how many kits are born into the wild, you mean, or how many born into captivity?
There was a chart in our book, and it just, the population numbers of kit births went up and down.
Yeah, so there are two places where kits are born. Some are in captivity, and that's so that we can save enough ferrets for reintroduction into the wild. So interestingly enough, remember when I talked about we trapped ferrets from that population in Wyoming, and we trapped 24 ferrets. Only 18 of those survived, and then only 7 of those actually contributed individual genetic material. So all ferrets released into the wild and born in captivity today come from 7 genetic founders. So sometimes animals born into captivity have to overcome some of that genetic bottleneck. In other cases, ferrets born into the wild have to learn how to be effective predators. So those ferrets need to learn how to kill prairie dogs in order to not starve. And then they also have to avoid predators, and they have to avoid disease. So numbers in the wild fluctuate for very natural reasons, predators, starvation reasons, or just variables of weather and climate and disease. And then those in captivity, it's all about breeding enough of different animals together to get as much of a wide range in genetics as possible to produce more kits into the wild. And some of that depends on how do you replicate conditions in the wild, like number of sunlight hours, number of dark hours, in order to have those conditions mimic what they do in the wild. Hopefully that answers your question, but it's a little bit complicated, but there are many variables that go into it. Really, really good question.
Okay, next up is Ms. Matthews' class.
Okay, go ahead, Logan.
All right, so I was just wondering, basically, considering the low amount in the population, what are you doing to reproduce all of them and get them back in the higher population number?
Really, really, really good question. So we are trying to be very successful in breeding them in captivity. And then what we learned, in order to take animals born in captivity, so typically ferret kits will disperse from their moms in the fall, so this time of the year. So we typically release them in the fall, but you can't take a ferret that's born into captivity and put it in the wild and expect it to do okay. So they have to go through a boot camp program to learn how to kill a prairie dog. So we've learned that if we can put the ferret kit in an area that's safe with their mom, then they learn how to kill prairie dogs. Then they do much better when they are released into the wild. So that's one thing that's increased survival in the wild. Another thing that we're doing is really working hard to prevent sylvatic plague from killing them and their prairie dog prey. And that's a really, really big, big effort. The other thing we're doing is trying to grow enough prairie dogs in enough places. And sometimes that means live trapping prairie dogs where they're not wanted, like maybe at a farmer's field, and we move them into an area where there are no complications, where we need ferrets to grow. So sometimes it's just a matter of growing more prairie dogs for them to eat. So that was really, really a good question. We do a lot of other things too, but like research, how can we better understand where ferrets are, how to count them, how to find them, you know, and where plague goes, like when plague comes and kills everything, where does it go after that? And how do we prevent it from doing that? So there are a lot of things, but it's really exciting. And every day I think about that, and every day I work hard to figure out something new that we can do or to raise money to do what we already are doing in a better way in more places. Great question.
Okay, next is Miss Engel's class. What's your next question for Kristy?
Why are people killing prairie dogs?
That's a really hard question. It's a little bit sad. So sometimes when you have animals that eat the same thing, there's competition, right? So what if we all had to live off one garden and there wasn't enough food for all of us? Things would get hard, right? People might start fighting over that cucumber or that tomato. So the same thing happens to cows and prairie dogs sometimes. In historical times, there were no fences, there were no roads, there were no houses, there were no train tracks, and bison and prairie dogs lived in harmony, and they could kind of move across the prairie as they needed to. Sometimes fire would come through, sometimes bison would trample down the grass. But then when we started moving into their habitat, we started putting up fences, we started making roads, we started putting up oil and gas wells, and then we added cows. And we asked cows to live in the same pasture as we asked prairie dogs to live in. And sometimes there's enough grass for both of them, and sometimes there isn't. And so prairie dogs get killed so that there can be more grass for cows, because we eat cows, not prairie dogs typically. So it's a resource issue in some ways. So my goal is to try to find enough places where cows and prairie dogs can live in harmony. And there are a lot of different ways we do that, but it's a matter of just creating space for both. Really hard question, but that was a good one.
Okay, Mrs. Bohannon and Mr. Albertson's group, you guys are up next.
What is the most accomplished thing you have done while being a scientist, and what are your challenges?
Can you please repeat that? I only heard the last part.
What is the most accomplished thing you have done while being a scientist, and what are your challenges?
Wow, you guys are asking some really tough questions. One of my most proudest moments has been establishing new ferret populations, mostly in Montana, but I've done that with a lot of really cool people on tribal lands in Montana. And that has been incredibly, incredibly, incredibly rewarding, because this is an area where ferrets used to live. And the tribes of Fort Belknap were very excited to bring ferrets back. And we were able to grow enough prairie dogs to bring ferrets back. And so in 2014, we were able to establish a new population. And it took several years of releases, but now we have ferrets living in the wild there and reproducing and creating babies. And it's a great science place for us to study and test new technologies like the thermal imaging camera that you saw through the video earlier. And it's all in concert with the people in the community living on the landscape. So we're creating opportunities for students to learn about what's in their own backyard. It's really, really, really exciting. I think one of the biggest challenges I have is that not everybody feels the same way I do about prairie dogs and ferrets. And so creating social tolerance of prairie dogs and creating more space for prairie dogs and ferrets is probably one of the hardest things I do. And also respecting other land uses and land activities like cattle grazing. No, those two things can go hand in hand, but it's very, very challenging and people get really upset sometimes. So it's about finding a happy medium. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges. The other biggest challenge is finding enough money to help ferrets on the ground. Some of the places that we work just don't have any funding for even a biologist. So how do I help raise money to help find a biologist to help monitor and save those ferret populations when I'm not able to do it all by myself? Really, really good question.
Okay, and last but not least, we have the helping ninjas.
So is the food that you give the ferrets and their prey blue so that they'll see it?
Can you say that again, please? The food that we give to ferrets? Maybe say that again.
Is it blue so that they'll see it?
Oh, the baits. Yes. So it is easier for them to see it and also for us to see it. So we dye the baits blue so that we can tell if a prairie dog has eaten one of those baits, their poop turns blue. So then we can tell that they've eaten them. So yeah, otherwise if it's brown, you can't see it because it blends in with the ground. So really fun question.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is take one more question from the chat, and then I think Kristy may have had a question come through on her end as well. So let's take the chat question here. Let's see. First, I want to say thanks to all of you that dropped questions in the chat. Barbara, Diana, Mrs. Harding's class. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm sorry we're running out of time. You can always drop your questions in an email to the Wild Classroom at WWF'S.org email address, and we can get those answered for you. But the one that we have time for, our last one here, is from Miss Ryland. It's kind of a two-part question for you here, Kristy. How many kinds of ferrets are there, and why did you want to work on saving black-footed ferrets?
Great questions. There is one species native to North America, and that's the black-footed ferret. There are Siberian polecats and European polecats that live in Europe and Siberia. And so those are different species, but some of the ferrets that are pets in the United States come from the European polecat. So there are no domesticated black-footed ferrets that people can have as pets. So black-footed ferrets are pretty special because they are the only ferret species native to North America and those living here today. Why did I get into black-footed ferrets? Well, it's a long story. I started studying wolves and grizzly bears, and I really wanted to become a wolf biologist, and I really wanted to study wolverines. And I didn't really know what the prairie was because I grew up in Vermont and spent a lot of time in Montana. So I actually got really lucky. I met a really cool person. And this is another important thing for you guys moving through school and moving into your careers. Who you meet matters because I met somebody who thought I was a pretty nice person. And they said, I would really love for you to come help establish populations of black-footed ferrets and swiftfox on the prairies of South Dakota. And I thought to myself, well, gosh, I've never really been to South Dakota. And I don't even know what a prairie ecosystem is, but I just got really lucky and I said yes. And it turns out that it was a really special opportunity and I am super grateful for it because not only is it one of the coolest jobs on earth, it is also really important because prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets are the underdogs, so to speak, of the Great Plains. Not too many people like them, not too many people want to study them, but yet they're very important to our ecosystem and to our health. And so I feel very honored to be here studying them. And that was a really fun question. So thanks for asking that. And one last question for my nephew, Luke. class. They want to know how many states and what states ferrets live in. And right now the answer is 8 states. We have Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah. That was 7. There's one more. Look it up. Let me know what I'm forgetting.
Well, that was awesome, Kristy. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope everyone had a great time today. I know I did. What we're going to do now is give everyone a chance to give a big, big thank you to Kristy. So I'm going to unmute everyone's microphone. Classes, be sure to say goodbye, say thanks.
And I want to say a big thanks to each and every one of you. This was really fun. Thank you for your interest. Go Team Ferret! Go Team Ferret! Thank you, everybody. Yeah!